I started dancing when I was 7 years old. I saw Ashton's La Fille Malgarde on the television, Michael Coleman and Leslie Collier. But I was less interested in them and most interested in the chicken dance, the beginning of Act 1. So it was Ashton's chicken dance that got me interested in ballet for the first time. And my mother enrolled me in a local ballet school in West Coker in Somerset. And I was, like so many others, I think one of two boys in a class that was primarily made up of young ladies. Village hall, back of a plastic chair in the middle of the room. And I think obviously my teacher must have seen something in me because she immediately suggested that I come up to London and audition for the junior associates of the Royal Ballet School. At the time, I think my parents were nervous to have me leave home, or I think at that stage they didn't understand that it was kind of a twice weekly commitment. So I think at first there was some trepidation about that, but I think through her persuasion and her endorsement of my abilities, they decided to do that. So I auditioned for the Royal Ballet School, was accepted as a junior associate. We made the twice weekly drive, 2.5 hours up and back. I was very lucky because both my parents were extremely supportive and both loved the arts. They'd met actually as doing Amdram. My dad was directing amateur dramatics and my mother was as a part of the amateur dramatic group. So they loved the theatre and were quite willing to, to make that journey for me. I spent 2 years as a junior associate and then went on to the Royal Ballet Lower School. Left home, very, very homesick for the first 2 years. But actually, we were very lucky because it was the first year, so my first year at the Royal Ballet School was the first year of the current production of The Nutcracker, the Peter Wright production of The Nutcracker. And even though it's gone through some changes over the years, it's still that production, that new production, will always be the new production to me. So that was a great distraction, being cast as a soldier and page boy and things in that. So that kind of got me through the first couple of years of White Lodge. Went through the Royal Ballet School. My teachers were then from the Vaganova School. In fact, again, there was a big switch over to the Vaganova method the first year that I joined the lower school. So suddenly the technique became Russian. My teacher was Anatoly Grigoriev from the now Mariinsky Theatre, and we were all terrified of him. Tough love, lots of tough love going on. I'm not sure that tough love would necessarily fly these days, but because it was lots of tough. But he instilled in us a great understanding of technique, and to this day, even my choreography, I feel, benefits from having had that really, really thorough training. Graduated from the lower school, went to the upper school, was lucky enough to be accepted to the upper school, which was then in Barons Court still. And my second year at the upper school, I went to the Prix de Lausanne International Ballet Competition. And I think to everyone's surprise, especially mine, I won the gold medal with the James first act variation from La Sylphide. Up until then, it had been sort of the Dinah and Actions, and the year before me was Kumikawa. 2 years before me was Kumikawa with Don Q, the best Don Q I think anyone had ever seen at that point. And then Carlos Acosta was the year before me with Dinah and Action. So I think from, I was surprised because I thought no one was going to be interested in a relatively simple, although it's actually really not now. I thought at the time, there are no tricks in this. It's not going to blow the roof off. But clearly they were looking for something maybe a bit different that year.
Mais pour nous, pour le concours télévision, c'est numéro 16. de succès de la part du public pour Christopher Wheeldon, concurrent numéro 7.
So I won the gold medal. I came back, graduated from the school in Balanchine's Valse Fantasy, which was my first time being exposed to dancing any Balanchine, and was really the beginning of that whole new journey for me. Largely because I'd never been asked to just purely embody music through movement. You know, until then, much of our rep training, our school performance work, seeing ballets at the Opera House involved characters, and I could see the Corps de Ballet, though they were busy in ballets, they were largely or often kind of spending the time playing character roles, and which not that I wasn't interested in that, but the Balanchine kind of literally swept me off my feet. I felt like I was free to just purely embrace movement and music. So that was really a kind of a wake-up call for me. And coincidentally then, after graduating, after being accepted into the Royal Ballet, I injured myself quite badly. I sprained my ankle on stage in Ashton's Sender Ballet, and had been training to go to the Eric Brune Prize in Toronto, which is a competition that all the companies that Brune was associated with attend. They send a professional couple, and I was supposed to dance the Sleeping Beauty pas de deux and the Dream pas de deux with Sarah Wildor. But unfortunately, because of my ankle, I couldn't go. So at the end of my rehabilitation, I just happened to see on television an advertisement for Hoover vacuum cleaners. And there was a special offer. If you bought a certain type of Hoover, you could apply for a free round trip ticket to New York.
2 return flight seats. Unbelievable.
So I bought the vacuum. I limped down to the shop. I bought the vacuum. I came home. I filled in the forms, and I sent the application in, and I got the ticket. So it was right towards the end of my rehab. I was back to the Royal Ballet the week after the mid-season break. I flew to New York. I will never forget that first night standing on the toilet of my friend's uncle who I was staying with on 34th Street, and just staring at the Empire State Building all night. It was the whole night. I didn't go to sleep that night. It was just felt like such a new energy being in that city. And then the next morning I went to the New York State Theatre. I'd written ahead to ask if I could take a ballet class, and they very graciously said, of course, you're from the Royal Ballet, come. And I explained I was rehabbing and I was needed back at work the next week, so it would be great to be able to take a proper class. And by accident, or I suppose in good fortune, the then director, Peter Martins, was auditioning another boy for the company, so he came to the class. And I remembered thinking, strange that the director's here. And he thought I was auditioning, and so he offered me the job. So there was a very, very strange, very fateful kind of turn of events, really. Just if you track from the injury to the vacuum cleaner to just taking class to keep fit, and then suddenly having a job with the New York City Ballet. It was obviously meant to be in some way, shape or form. So I politely said, could I think about it? Because that hadn't really been my intention at all. And I spent the week seeing performances of the New York City Ballet, having my mind kind of blown by ballets like The Four Temperaments and Square Dance and Opus 19, The Dreamer, and Prodigal Son, and Vienna Waltzes. None of these ballets I'd seen before. I'd seen clips, maybe on dance films, but even then, there really hadn't been very much footage taken of the New York City Ballet, or at least shown here, so I didn't know the company. And I was like, that sure beats dancing around a maypole, which was kind of where I was headed as a Corps de Ballet member at that moment. So I decided to leave the Royal Ballet. I asked Anthony Dowell, who was the director here, if I could just take a year's leave of absence, because I also kind of hoped that my technique would grow and I would come back and skip the maypole part and hopefully start diving into some more soloist roles. So I asked for a year's leave of absence, and that was 28 years ago. So I've been in New York now for a long time, more time than I've been here. My years dancing with the New York City Ballet were complicated because I had to change my technique. I had to learn how to sort of utilize all the great benefits that I'd gained from the Vaganova training, which is thorough but kind of slow, and translate that into the speed and agility of the Balanchine technique. I had some things on my side and some things really against me. I had quite fast footwork, but I never had a huge jump. So I kind of had the power, but it was sort of adjusting to the new coordination of very little kind of epaulement and more just sort of power and attack in the legs, speed in the legs. I danced for Robbins for the last 4 years of his life. He really liked my dancing. I think having, worked here a little bit, having his ballet staged on the Royal Ballet, one of the first ballets he cast me in was Dances at a Gathering. And he actually said to me, pulled me aside one day, and he's like, "I like your Englishness, kid. Reminds me of the time that I came and set this on the Royal Ballet." So that was very nice. I danced in Brandenburg Concerto he created on me. I was a member of the cast. And I was in the very first cast of the West Side Story suite of dances that he put together from his great musical. So I got some good time with Robbins, and he was really the last living great choreographer of that generation, which was another good reason to go to New York, because Ashton had gone. Sir Kenneth passed away during the performance of Myling that I was in here as a first-year corps de ballet member, and I remember just the huge sense of loss within the company. And then this opportunity came up, so I thought, go to New York and try and get some time with the final kind of great of that generation, which I did. And then choreography sort of happened fairly naturally. There's been a great tradition, of course, always of new choreography at the New York City Ballet, beginning with Balanchine and Robbins, and then when Peter took over the company in the late 80s, mid-80s, he very much pushed for new work, and there was a lot of encouragement, and so he started me slowly at the school, moved me sort of up to creating small pieces for the school workshop, and then finally I got my chance to make a ballet for the New York City Ballet for the main stage. My first ballet for the New York City Ballet was a ballet called Slavonic Dances, to some of the Dvorak Slavonic dances. And I remember Clive Barnes, actually, who had been the New York Times dance critic, but was then the New York Post dance critic. I remember his review was kind of, it was critical, but the thing that I remembered from it was that he called me a diamond in the rough, which to me was the biggest compliment. I don't think at that stage I'd even really thought very much about the impact of reviews and how they might affect a career. But I remember then that the Post review was better than the Times review. The Times review, Anna Kisselkoff, was so-so. It was encouraging, but I just remembered this diamond in the rough, and I thought, okay, I can be that. I can polish myself up and get better. So fairly soon after that, I was given a second opportunity to make a new ballet for the New York City Ballet. And that was really the one, I think, that kind of, that was Polyphonia, which was the ballet that actually kind of, I think, sort of jettisoned me a little bit, and really made people sit up and notice. And that was to the piano music of Ligeti, very knotty, kind of spiky, but sort of deeply lyrical as well. And it sparked something inside of me that I think I didn't even know really was there, and how much I'd already learned from being in the House of Balanchine and dancing within those ballets and understanding architecture and understanding structure, but also from having danced with Robbins, I think the playfulness and the human interaction. So I think it's funny because I look at Polyphonia now and I see how much Balanchine and how much Robbins there is in that. But I also now, having made a lot of work since, also recognize, of course, the influence of Macmillan and Ashton, without a doubt. Particularly with story ballets and building character. So Polyphonia kind of launched me, and then then I started getting quite a lot of offers to create ballets for other companies. I was still dancing. I was still ambitious to really get up to the top ranks of the New York City Ballet as a dancer. But there was definitely sort of a pull. I started to be kind of pulled into directions. And I remember Peter saying to me, you can't do both. You're going to, sooner or later, one or the other's going to give. Maybe you should slow down on the choreography and just for now focus on your dancing. The choreography will always be there. But Sir Kenneth had pulled me aside after doing a workshop here in London when I was with the company. And he said to me, and I think quite uncharacteristically, he said to me, you have a lot of talent as a choreographer. You have to practice, hone your craft, and take every opportunity you can to get better. So I have always had that voice in the back of my head, and I wasn't willing to really make the sacrifice to become a top dancer. And I think actually there was a very kind of quite realistic moment where I recognized my weakness as a dancer, which was always my partnering. Not so much as a choreographer. In fact, funnily enough, I think I maybe ended up sort of compensating in a way through my choreography for my inability to really naturally feel the weight of a ballerina. And it was frustrating to me because I knew I could pretty much tick all the other boxes. I was always happy when I was dancing alone, but very much felt responsible and uncomfortable when it came to complex partnering. So I made the decision at 28 to, rather than get more and more frustrated with myself, to actually stop dancing and move into choreography full time, take on more commissions, and leave the stage behind. Which is, in hindsight, actually, I don't have any regrets. I still watch performances sometimes from choreographers that I admire and wonder what it would be like to be up there dancing those pieces. But I actually don't miss the pain, the physical pain. I don't miss the emotional pain of not being cast in something or feeling like you've put in the work and not, for whatever reason, being recognized by the choreographers or the directors or whatever. Those are all things that happen in careers, even in top careers, and I had had enough of it. And I felt like I had really danced. I mean, I had danced a lot of repertoire at the New York City Ballet. And I got to finish with my favorite, a piece that I'd been dying to dance really all my career, and the timing just worked out that one of the dancers who I'd been covering for the 7 years I was in New York left the company. So I got to slot into Fancy Free by Jerome Robbins, and Jerry had passed by then, but had had me learn it pretty much from the beginning. And it was just one of those works that I would watch every performance and think, oh, I'm never going to get my chance in this. And finally I did. So that was a nice sort of finisher to my dance career. And then the focus became making ballets and taking commissions, working with lots of different dancers all over the world, mostly at the beginning in the US, but popping back over here every now and then to make some works for the Royal Ballet. The first main stage work that I made for the company was Tryst, actually, no, that's not true. My first full one-act main stage ballet was Tryst. Prior to that, I made Pavan for Darcy Bussell and Jonathan Cope. And that started sort of a very rather lovely kind of parallel relationship to the relationship that I was, artistic relationship I was having at the time with Wendy Whalen and Jock Soto in New York. I here was working a lot with Jonathan Cope and Darcy Bussell, and having the opportunity to be obviously the same choreographer, but working in two very different styles with two very different kind of couples, individuals as well, of course. I think was really sort of informative, and actually was a very interesting kind of back and forth. I would take some kind of inspiration from the work I would do here with Darcy and Johnny and go back to Wendy and Jock and vice versa. So it was a really interesting period, and I still look back at those ballets that I made for those two couples and look at them, see them as, you know, still some of the strongest work that, you know, that I've done. And I've had many opportunities to work with other great dancers, of course, but I think it was the consistency as well. And I think particularly Wendy and Jock sort of were shaping the way that I was becoming a choreographer. And they were sort of helping me to sort of find out who I was as an artist, what my voice was and now is. So that was a great period of time. I was working consistently with San Francisco Ballet, another company that I love to work with. And then in 2001, which was also around the time that I retired from New York City Ballet, I choreographed The Sweet Smell of Success on Broadway, which was not a success, but was a huge opportunity for me to put my foot, you know, through that door and start sort of thinking about making pieces for theatre as well as for the opera houses. And theatre had been almost an equal love for me, musical theatre as ballet, as dance. I just couldn't sing, so I think, you know, my talents lay obviously in the ballet studio and not on the musical theatre stage. But I grew up loving those shows and seeing them with my parents, and so the opportunity to start doing some work on Broadway was huge.
It's been an amazing trip for me. I mean, from the workshop 18 months ago to opening night. I mean, I didn't think we would get there, but we did, and I'm just thrilled to be a part of this.
So The Sweet Smell of Success was a new musical composed by Marvin Hamlisch, the great composer of Chorus Line, and directed by Nick Heitner, who has continued to be a friend and mentor since then. And a book by John Guare, the great American playwright. So, you know, at 28, I think I was then, I was definitely the youngest and most inexperienced member of the team. But I felt like I was living in sort of my youth, my childhood fantasy, you know, going in, building a new musical with these kind of giants of the theatre. And again, the most brilliant education in both directing and choreographing. It was a hard experience. It was harder for all of them because they had they had lived many theatrical lives and had made many shows. So when the show wasn't a success, I remembered everyone around me being so kind of deeply depressed. I was sad because I think it was a good show. I think it was a much better show actually than it was given credit for, and I think eventually it will come around again. Unfortunately, it was a show about sort of the dark side, the gossipy side of the press at a time when we just come out of 9/11, and I think there was a desire for joy, and so time wasn't really on our side. I mean, among other problems, I'm sure. But I came out of it just kind of really excited at the possibility of doing another musical. However, many years passed before I did actually step back into the musical theatre world. And in the meantime, I had been given the position of a resident choreographer with the New York City Ballet, which was a huge honor. It was a position that had never really been created before. No one had ever been specifically called that. But I very much felt like I was sort of I was kind of following in the footsteps of Robbins and Balanchine, which was a huge honor, and kind of a curse as well, because those were such great men, genius men. And, after a few years of doing that, I decided it was maybe time for me to form my own company. I sort of had a really intense desire to pull together a small group of dancers and really curate their experience as dancers in a company. Really sort of, almost in a boutique way, bring in repertoire specifically for the people that I had in the company, and then of course make new ballets for them. And I was probably the beginning of the shift away from sort of the old school, ballet mentality, which was you don't speak until you're spoken to, sort of a little bit of an infantile, and very respectful time where we really were just kind of bodies in a room, and you didn't talk back to Robbins, you didn't offer up ideas to Robbins, you didn't. So, and I always loved the collaboration, and that came from my work with Jock and Wendy and Darcy and Johnny, actually, because we talked things through, and I loved they knew their bodies better than anyone else, and sometimes there were just things that they would fall into that would be far more interesting than what I'd initially asked from them. So I also wanted to cultivate that, an open space where people felt that they could have a voice as well as artists and be treated like adults. So I started Morphoses, we made the decision, we started raising money, and just before we opened, the entire world economy crashed. It was 2008 and everything just went, and we hadn't even performed yet. And so we saw an inevitable drop in donations. Even though we did very well, we still managed to go to the Sydney Festival. We had a US tour, we had a Canadian tour, we had a relationship with Sadler's Wells. They were very supportive of us. We had a relationship in New York with City Center. Those were our two sort of homes. I found myself spending more time trying to fundraise and also reteaching old work, because I couldn't pay dancers long enough to keep them from gig to gig, so they would go off and find other work. I would have to rehire other dancers and then teach them the work that I'd done. So it didn't end up being the sort of factory, the kind of dance lab that I'd hoped that it would be. Having said that, we made a lot of really wonderful work. I had some great choreographers come in. Ratmansky came in, Paul Lightfoot and Sol Leon came in, Bill Forsyth came in. We had We had some young choreographers create new work. Tim Harbour from Australia came over and made some work for us. Emily Molnar, who's now the director of NDT, was one of the first choreographers to make work for us. So it was a good time, but it was clear to me after 3 years that fundraising was not necessarily where I wanted to spend my time, and we couldn't find a development director, and it just became too hard to sustain at that moment. I think had it been a different time, then perhaps Morphoses may still exist and we may have gone from strength to strength, but it just felt like my energies were being drained and not in a creative way. So decided to step away. It wasn't the cleanest break, I have to say. It was a little bit tumultuous at the time, but it was the right thing to do. And it was right sort of on the doorstep of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And in part, I knew Alice was coming. I'd agreed to do it with Monica Mason, and it just felt like in order to really devote my time to Alice, I wouldn't be able to be with Morphoses for a year anyway, and so as disappointing as I think it was to step away, I now think it was the right thing to do. So Alice in Wonderland was my first original score full-length ballet, narrative ballet. I'd choreographed Swan Lake for the Pennsylvania Ballet and A Midsummer Night's Dream for the Colorado Ballet years before, but both Swan Lake obviously was the Tchaikovsky and Midsummer Night's Dream was Mendelssohn. So this was the first time that I sat down with a composer and with a piece of literature and with a designer and actually with a playwright and started to started the process, which I now love, of kind of mapping out the early stages of a new full-length ballet. Which parts of the story do we tell? How do we structure that so that it sort of meets the needs of a ballet company? Soloists, principals, corps de ballet. What can we learn from the structures of the traditional classic full-length ballets? What can we throw out of that? What no longer feels relevant to today? So that process began. We picked out the bits of story that we wanted to tell. We decided, well, we won't look through the looking glass. We'll just focus on Wonderland. And then working with Joby Tolbert, the composer, we start to sort of create a framework of, okay, so we need to introduce all the characters here. So that's probably, at a pace, at a good kind of theatrical clip, that's probably going to be 7 or 8 minutes. So let's make that 7 or 8 minutes. Alice falling down the hole. That's going to probably be mostly a visual thing. We don't want to spend too much time in that. Let's make that, and it's kind of a shot in the dark, really, but let's make that, 40 seconds. And so we build up a sort of timed out version of what the score might sort of play out to. And then Joby goes away, he starts to compose, he'll send me files. I distinctly remember driving across the Brooklyn Bridge in my Mini, because I was living in Brooklyn at the time, and I had a very cute little Mini Cooper, and listening to the first 6 minutes of Alice in Wonderland and on my car radio, and immediately feeling like I was sort of barreling into this wonderful world. So Joby sends me music, I listen, I approved of all of it actually. There was only one section of the original score that we ended up cutting, and we made some additions along the way, but get to know the music, into the studio, start to work on the movement, and by that point, designs are usually created. And that Alice was tricky because we didn't want to be slavish to either the Disney or the Tenniel. We wanted to create a kind of visual language, visual world that felt very us, and also utilize some of the more kind of technological advances in stage magic and that kind of thing. So Bob came up with this wonderful kind of distillation, contemporary sort of distillation of the original characters, and yeah, off we went. And now I think we have 9 companies of Alice around the world, which is fantastic. Always proves to be very, very popular with audiences. Critics are always grumpy about it, but the audiences love it, and it has this wonderful life. Really, Alice has been very good to me over the years, and I have seen some wonderful performances from dancers in Japan, in Australia. That's been great. So Alice was successful, and that then led to another commission from the Royal Ballet for another full-length story ballet, and I was eager to choose a story that was less episodic. Alice had been kind of, in a way, sort of an easy gig, because you can kind of get away with jumping from kind of zany, crazy situation to and mixing styles, mixing dance styles, mixing musical styles. I wanted to actually take on a more complex and sort of tightly woven narrative that would necessitate kind of a proper sort of character arc. So I chose The Winter's Tale, and everyone was just shaking their heads and going, "That's just crazy, you don't do that. It's like, it's not even his strongest play. Why are you doing The Winter's Tale? It's too complicated. No one will get it." But I chose it nonetheless, and because I really did feel that there were ways to maybe even kind of smooth out the parts that didn't quite work in the play itself, using the language of dance. Of course, you can exist in a more poetic realm anyway with movement, with ballet. So Winter's Tale happened, and it worked, and everyone was very happy about that. And now the Bolshoi have performed Winter's Tale, of course, in National Ballet of Canada. It was a co-production with them, so they have had a few seasons with it. And this past year, the Hamburg Ballet was supposed to perform it. It's now been postponed to this year. We hope it'll happen this year. If it doesn't happen this year, it'll happen next year. And that will be really interesting, because they are a company of really fine dance actors, because of their work with John Normaier. I've been very fortunate to work with the Bolshoi twice now in my career. The first time was complicated for many reasons. Moscow felt very depressed. Even the center of Moscow around the Bolshoi felt very dark. I went in winter, so of course it was freezing. And I took with me some of the fears that I had surrounding my training and my teacher, and it felt, Moscow and the Bolshoi felt very inaccessible to me. And then, of course, on top of that, I was working with a few complicated personalities in the studio who didn't make my life particularly easy. So you kind of pile that up, and you've sort of kind of got recipe for a little bit of a disaster. Although in the end, actually, the experience was wonderful, because once the complicated personality had removed himself from the room, the dancers actually that I was left with relaxed and were extremely collaborative and extremely excited about making new work. And even though I don't feel like I made my best work there, I fell in love with that group of dancers, and hoped that some of the complexities of that visit wouldn't stop me from coming back in the future. And some considerable amount of time passed, but they invited me back to do Winter's Tale a couple of years ago, and the company felt like it had sort of done this 360. A lot more Western choreographers had been in. It's one of the few companies still that very much holds on to its tradition and its style. You know, you watch a performance by the Bolshoi, they're Bolshoi dancers, there's no questioning. There is an attack, freedom, in combination with, you know, a phenomenal sense of technique, and it's really, if you go to on a good night, there's kind of nothing like it, I think. And so the dancers now also, most of them speak English, so the communication, even though I had an interpreter, the communication is easier. They're back in the new old Bolshoi, so they're back in their theatre. And Winter's Tale just worked as a piece for them. You know, they are great artists. They have a great. They find it easy to access big emotion in a way that is both convincing and dramatic and theatrical. So, and then I got to work with the sort of newer generation of stars there. Olga Smirnova, who it's like she was born to be a ballerina. Everything about Olga is kind of pristine and beautiful. And she just happens to be the most modest, kind, you know, there are no airs and graces, there's no diva-like kind of atmosphere around her. Denis Savin, who had been a very, very young dancer in the company when I went the first time, starting to do quite a lot of work with Alexei Ratmansky. Alexei used him a lot. He was my Leontes. And again, very quiet man, very humble, very thoughtful, and ultimately extremely powerful in the role. The combination of the two of them was extraordinary. The only unfortunate occurrence through the whole, and it was a big one, was on opening night, the dancer who was playing Florizel came out, first jump, double cabriole, and I heard a bang, and it's the kind of bang that you hear and you kind of know what it is because you've been around it before. And my heart sank, and he limped off stage, and the curtain came down, and we sat in the theatre for about 30-minute extra intermission, and of course everyone was a Twitter and high drama, and I went backstage, and of course he was quite badly hurt. He'd ruptured his Achilles. Luckily, the third understudy, very young, I think he's like 21, 22, sitting at home on his sofa, really nearby the theatre, runs in. That was his warm-up. Running to the theatre was his warm-up. He kind of like walks into the costume, no makeup, out on stage. And, you know, it was really, considering he was dancing with a partner he hadn't danced with, it was really a really, really good performance. And it kind of lifted what potentially, and still was in some ways, quite a tragic occurrence. It lifted the spirits of everyone in the theatre, and everyone was gunning for him, and it ended up being a very joyous opening night.
Это идеальный персонаж, и она идеальная королева, она идеальная мать.
Здесь есть все. Любовь, ненависть, презрение, мнимое предательство, пауки, которые грызут человека изнутри. Все это видно, все это успевает сыграть, и, конечно, одно удовольствие и счастье участвовать в такой постановке.
Carrying on with this idea of Shakespeare's that Bohemia is this imaginary, idyllic place, I've taken folk instruments from all around the world, a bansuri, which is a bamboo flute from India, to create the sound of a folk music of a culture that doesn't really exist.
По Шекспиру это праздник стрижки овец. И достаточно такие глубокие вещи в этой пьесе сказаны о прощении, о любви, и мне просто было интересно быть частью этого спектакля.
I think this ballet suits very much the Russian dancers because they are dramatic and emotional. The dramatic quality of the Bolshoi dancer, that sets them apart from any other dancer in any other company. And that's why I think it works so well for this piece.
Мне кажется, что сегодня этот спектакль на нашей сцене совсем по-другому звучит, танцуется, играется, и в этом смысле это замечательное приобретение.
Almost 11 years after Sweet Smell of Success came an offer from a producer who'd obtained the rights to An American in Paris to direct and choreograph a new Broadway musical based on the original movie, because it had never been performed on stage before. There had never been a stage musical of American in Paris, which, you know, now seems of course it was fortuitous for me because I got to be the person to do it. But it's surprising that it hadn't been done on stage before. And so they asked me if I would both choreograph and direct. I was very nervous about directing because I'd never worked with actors. I'd watched other directors work with actors, but didn't feel versed in the language of actors. And I took some persuading and sort of a guarantee that there would be lots of outs, either for them or for me, you know, throughout the process. The process of putting together a new musical is vast, and it goes on for 2 or 3 years, and there are workshops and readings, and so I agreed finally, and we, you know, took it sort of fairly slowly. We did a reading which went fairly well, and then a workshop that everyone was very excited about, and then we took the show. We opened the show in Paris, actually, at the Châtelet, Théâtre du Châtelet in Paris, and then took it to Broadway. And it was, for me, kind of like throwing all the windows and all the doors open. I'd made a lot of ballets. I have made a lot of ballets over the years, and I think I felt at that point a little bit like, okay, well, I know I've still got more in me, but like, how much longer am I going to want to jump around the world and you know, keep working on sort of on demand in a sense, and with very, very tight schedules. More often than not, you only have 3 or 4 weeks to chuck a ballet together, and sometimes it feels like that. You know, sometimes it feels like there's no real time to craft, or you just got to get it done because you've only got this amount of time. So, and that's what I loved about the Broadway process. There's time to craft, there's time to make mistakes, and the schedule is built so that you make your mistakes and then you do another reading or another workshop and you rectify those until you shape, and you keep shaping all the way up until, you know, the press come, really. So I loved the process. It was the most uncomfortable thing I've ever done in my life. I just felt like I was in cold sweats all the time that I was working with the actors. Like, the voice in the back of my head is saying, you have no right to be here, you don't know what you're doing. And so it was terrifying, actually. But I lent into the fear, and the result was fantastic. And now I feel like I'm still very much a student of directing, but I can walk into a room with actors now and feel relatively confident about my ability to actually draw a performance out of them. And I realize that there is no handbook on directing. Directing is very, very much about who you are, how you go about it. I go about it physically, because that's my world, but ultimately the goal is to tell the truth, or have somebody that you truly believe in as the embodiment of a character. And how you get there doesn't really matter, because in the end the curtain's going to go up and the audience are either going to go with it or they aren't.
I've got beginner's luck. The first time that I'm in love with you. Gosh, I'm lucky. I've got beginner's luck. It's wonderful. Small us that she should care.
I'm waiting for the man
So now I'm directing another musical, which again has been put on hold. And you know, it's controversial because it's about Michael Jackson, and of course that's been a very controversial topic for the last 30 years, but perhaps particularly so because of the documentary. But it's a book written by a two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning author, Lynn Nottage, who's one of the great Black American female playwrights, if not the great at the moment. And so what we're doing is something, I think, unexpected, perhaps. That's the best way to put it at this point. It hasn't come out yet, so I don't want to sit and describe anything, but we're working hard on that, and hopefully when Broadway comes back, we'll be one of the first shows to help kind of reboot the Broadway community. And now I'm currently working on my new full length for the Royal Ballet, which will open next year. Again, it was supposed to be last fall, then it was going to be sometime this year, and now it's been bumped to next year. But I'm not at liberty yet to say what it is because it hasn't been announced by the company. But again, it's a very, very rich tale. I suppose, in many ways, perhaps the most ambitious yet of the story ballets that I've worked on, because of the density of the narrative, but we'll see. Too early to know how that's going to go.